Unidentified flying objects. As the subtitle tells us, we're looking at, are there any images that need an extraterrestrial explanation? So what got me started was a survey carried out many years ago, where the question was asked, have extraterrestrial aliens visited the Earth? This was a survey carried out in America a few years back. I'd like to find more recent information. I'd like to find out what Europeans think, but this was an American survey carried out in 2018. And in answer to the question, have extraterrestrial aliens visited Earth, 40% said probably or yes. That's an amazingly high percentage, even for Americans. When asked, are extraterrestrial aliens visiting now, you'd think that number would be a lot lower. No, 35%. And the scary thing is that's not only less than the number who believe in ghosts, but greater than the number who believe in telekinesis or Bigfoot. But most worryingly, it's bigger than the number who believe in evolution. So yes, you have to take this with a pinch of salt, because this is an American survey, as indicated in the bottom there, not the rest of the world. But even so, I'd be very intrigued to know how the numbers stack up in the UK or in Europe. So you might think, surely the whole business of UFOs and Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot, shouldn't that be settled? Because if we look at the plot there of the number of people who've carried a phone with them with a camera on board every waking moment of their lives, that's gone from almost zero to 3 decades ago to almost 100%. So surely if flying saucers or lake monsters or ghosts or Bigfoot, if they do exist, shouldn't we have plenty of evidence by now? Isn't the issue settled? Well, no, it's not settled. If you Google hits for UFOs, you find not just a few, but some 250 million web pages dedicated to UFOs. So this implies that despite the fact that half the world's population carry cameras, it's not settled. And I would argue that UFO images, and I'll be talking about images in this talk, I'm not talking about UFO reports from people, I'm not talking about alien abductions, I'm talking about looking at images. And I would argue that they fall into a number of distinct categories. They could be man-made objects, they could be natural objects, they could be image artifacts, or they could be deliberately faked. And the elephant in the room, yes, there is a fifth category. They could be extraterrestrial spacecraft. So before we get started, let's just make sure we understand the definitions. I'm going to use the usual conventional acronym UFO to mean an object observed in the sky that is not readily identified. Regarding an extraterrestrial origin, I definitely side with Carl Sagan. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you're going to claim that a light in the sky is an alien spacecraft, you need some damn good evidence that backs you up. And a useful tool for any rational scientist is Occam's razor, which states that if there are two explanations for an observation, then the one that requires the least speculation is usually the better. This is often paraphrased as simpler solutions are more likely to be correct than complex ones. So where do you find reliable information about UFOs? Well, you can go to America, where they have lots of UFO information centres. Notice the gentleman on the front porch there, the man in green. But unfortunately, we can't get a lot of reliable information. We can gather images from decades gone by, but we very rarely find an image, a photograph, which is clear and detailed and in focus, with no movement of the camera, no camera shake, and well exposed. What we usually find is quite the opposite. It's blurred, out of focus, with a lot of camera movement, and usually overexposed, especially if it's been taken at night. So this little blob in the middle there, well, if we blow it up, it just becomes a bigger blob. It doesn't tell us what it is. We've got no idea what this object is, and no amount of image processing or image analysis can help us understand the origin of this. It's not helped by the fact that most images taken on film, rather than more recently on digital cameras, the information, the metadata about the photograph is not stored with the photograph. So we don't know which camera took it, we don't know what lens, we don't know the exposure, we don't know the F number, we don't know the speed of the film, we don't know the date on which it was taken, we don't know the direction in which the camera was pointing, we don't know the time of day, was it day or night or dusk or dawn. Without that information, it's very difficult to figure out what it is we're looking at. So let's have a look at some of these categories. Let's have a look first at UFOs, which quite definitely fall into the category of man-made objects. Have a look at this image here. Is this a long exposure photo of a fleet of UFOs flying in formation? Well, perhaps you can see that there's a silhouette at the front there. I presume that's a tree, some foliage in the foreground. But apart from that, what is it we're looking at? I'll give you a second to think about it. Is it commercial aircraft flying? No, they don't fly in formation like that. Is it military aircraft? They fly in formation, yes, but not at night. I've misled you slightly by saying it's a long exposure. Actually, it's a snapshot, and it's a snapshot taken from Pylon of the Month, December 2019. And yes, we can't see an electricity pylon there because it's a misty night. If we could see it, it would be somewhere like that. I've placed it in there just to give you context. Let's take it back out again. So in other words, it was a misty night. There's some light over the horizon. The cables are iced up and so are reflecting light from a light over the horizon. And so we're looking simply at electricity cables strung between pylons. And I was being deliberately mischievous there by suggesting that it might be a long exposure, making you think that these were trails in the sky rather than a snapshot of cables. So you do have to be careful when you look at images, because sometimes the person posting the image or presenting the image is trying to mislead you. And for those that are interested, yes, there is such a thing as Pylon of the Month. There you go, pylonofthemonth.org. Go look it up if you're interested. And of course, occasionally in America, you will see some very odd things in the sky, especially shortly after the launch of a rocket, because rockets produce a vapor trail, an exhaust trail, which can be illuminated by the setting sun and produce all sorts of weird and wonderful things in the sky. The actual shape of the exhaust trail will depend precisely on the trajectory of the rocket and exactly where the sun is to illuminate that. Sometimes the rocket trail, although it might start straight, winds in the atmosphere will be at different strengths at different heights and can contort the rocket trail into a very jagged trail, and in this case produce rather iridescent effects as well. When you see this in the sky, if you saw this in the sky, you might be forgiven to thinking this is a prelude of an alien invasion or something like that, if you didn't realise that this was simply scientists sending up sounding rockets and releasing fluorescent dyes at various heights in the atmosphere in order to get an idea of exactly how winds vary at different heights. So here is effectively a short exposure of the sky deliberately taken to tell us what the atmosphere is doing. But if you didn't know that experiment was taking place, you could be forgiven for thinking something more obscure was happening. A couple of decades ago, we might have been fooled into thinking this was rather weird. A lot of lights in the sky dancing around in certain patterns. But of course, in the last few years, we've got rather used to the idea of drones with lights, the control of which is now much better than it was a couple of decades ago. So now they can be positioned very accurately and produce almost any pattern we like in the sky. So what would have been rather odd a couple of decades ago is now almost commonplace. People have claimed not only of seeing extraterrestrial spacecraft, but also seeing their landing pads. This passenger flying over the western USA looked down into the desert and saw 3 landing pads for UFOs. Well, it's actually not that difficult, even if you don't have a GPS system in the screen on the back of the seat in front of you. Even if you didn't have that, it's not that difficult to work out. If you've gone from A to B and you know when you took off and you know when you landed, you can figure out that if you took this picture at a particular time, you can work out roughly where you were over the USA. And then all you need is Google Earth to look at what it is that you're actually looking at. And it turns out to be a solar plant, a plant with a lot of reflected mirrors, which, when seen at particular angles, can give odd reflective effects, especially when you can't make out the individual mirrors if you're flying 5 or 6 miles up in the atmosphere overhead. So a very simple explanation if you know what it is what you're looking at. I intended this talk to be mainly looking at images, but I got distracted into videos. And you know what it's like. As soon as you go into YouTube, you can end up looking at lots and lots of videos. This is one taken quite a while ago. I've taken the sound off because the very energetic photographer got very excited and couldn't keep the camera still, which is a common trait of a lot of videos. Here he says there is a cigar-shaped UFO floating over the lake. This was posted on social media and obtained a huge number of views, even though within hours of it being posted, the explanation was there. Goodyear said, "We don't want to get in the way of a good story, but that's definitely us. It's the Goodyear blimp," excuse me, floating over a football stadium on the other side of the lake. Even though the explanation was there hours later, that didn't stop people watching the video and agreeing that, yep, that's definitely a UFO. That went on for weeks and months and possibly even years afterwards, even though the explanation was clear. When I got into YouTube, I found a few other references, including one to a super clear footage of an unidentified flying object. Well, I thought, given that most of these UFO videos are very blurry and very indistinct, I was excited at the prospect of seeing a super clear footage of a UFO. So I thought I had to click on this one. And this is what I saw. So, any thoughts as to what that might be? I'm not going to ask for a show of hands as this is a Zoom talk, but after a little while, the photographer settled down, got his zoom camera under control, perhaps steadied himself against something, and eventually did produce some reasonably clear footage of what it was he or she was photographing. And now it is a little bit clearer as to what was being photographed. It's a balloon, a mylar, shiny balloon. Perhaps a Jennifer or a John had a party and the balloon escaped and floated up into the atmosphere, and the sun catching it can produce some wonderfully reflective and sometimes very colourful effects. So if you haven't got a good pair of binoculars or a zoom lens on your camera, perhaps you can be fooled into thinking you're seeing something rather unusual. But again, once I started looking at a few videos, I decided not to spend the rest of my life watching videos of UFOs. But one thing did pique my interest. There was a description that said Puerto Rico, being close to the Bermuda Triangle, is a hotbed of UFOs. And it was this next sentence that caught my eye. There have been countless UFO sightings, but many experts consider this next piece of footage the gold standard. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to spend my life looking at thousands of videos. This one is considered by experts, I don't know who the experts are, but this one is considered the gold standard of videos of UFOs. So I thought that's probably worth having a look at. Does it stand up to scrutiny if we have a look at it? I thought this might be worth looking at because it was a video taken by the US Customs and Border Patrol aircraft, an infrared camera on board an aircraft. Now, the USA are quite keen on patrolling their borders, looking for people or contraband crossing the border, and they can afford high tech. So I figured that this infrared camera in an aircraft was probably high quality. Not only that, but the video runs for a couple of minutes or so, not just a few seconds. And here we see what is purported to be a small object going hell for leather across the countryside over Puerto Rico. It's travelling at great speed, it is said, and it travels over the countryside. It passes through fields of, I don't know, probably cows. That might have been a golf course, I don't know. And it heads over towards the Puerto Rico airport. As it heads over some industrial estate and some houses, it passes over, I think, a taxiway of the airport, and then it passes over the runway of the airport and then continues to head north at what is said to be incredible speeds. Well, I thought this is interesting. This object is passing over an industrial estate and then a road, and then it passes over a few more fields. The video is 2 or 3 minutes long, and I've chopped it down a little bit for the sake of brevity. Now, in this particular video, I thought this was really useful because of not only what we're seeing, a small black dot. This is infrared, so black means warmer than the background. Not only have we got the video, a relatively long video of the object moving, but we also have in the bottom left-hand corner on every frame of the video the GPS coordinates of the aircraft. ACFT means aircraft, and then we have the north and west longitude and latitude. And on the right-hand side, even more useful, because this infrared camera knows where it's pointing and the system knows how high the aircraft is and exactly where the aircraft is, it can work out where the aircraft is pointing, where the camera is pointing. So target in the bottom right-hand corner is the GPS coordinates of the point at which the camera is looking. That point on the Earth, basically just behind the UFO, is given by that north and west latitude and longitude. So we know exactly where the aircraft is and exactly where the camera is pointing. There are very few UFO videos where you get that extent of information. So we saw the UFO pass a number of objects. It passed apparently a field full of what I can guess are animals because they're warm. I think they're probably cows. So this object is a bit smaller than a cow and perhaps the same sort of temperature. Later it crosses the airfield and then crosses a road on which a few cars are travelling down the road. Not surprisingly, part of the car is warmer than the rest because there's an engine in there somewhere. And again, the object is perhaps about the size of a small, perhaps smaller than a car, and perhaps a similar temperature to the hood or the bonnet of a car. So let's actually work out what's actually going on with this gold standard video of a UFO. This is the area concerned. It's an airport in the northwest of Puerto Rico. And that's the scale, 1 kilometre, shown at the bottom there. I'm not interested particularly in the land features, so I'm just going to grey that out a little bit. Knowing the positions as indicated in the target, we can plot the positions of the UFO. And it moved as indicated by that arrow from the southwest to the northeast. And the people that believe this is extraterrestrial will say, look at this. This UFO was moving against the wind because the wind at the time was something like 18 miles an hour from the northeast towards the southwest. So the UFO appeared to be moving against the wind. Therefore, they say not only is it moving really fast, it's moving really fast into a headwind. That makes it very unusual. Well, maybe it does. But this, remember, is just where the UFO appears to be. Let's have a look at where the aircraft is that took the video, frame by frame by frame. I'm not going to do every frame, but every 10th frame or something. Let's plot out where the aircraft was. There's the aircraft track, travelling from the northwest to the southeast. And if we take one particular example of the UFO movement, at that particular position where the aircraft is, there's the line of sight to the UFO. So that's where the UFO appeared to be, or at least that's the point on the ground immediately behind the UFO. But to work out what the UFO is actually doing, Let's take a number of different lines of sight from the aircraft to where the UFO appears to be. Let's do it 20 seconds later, and then another 20 seconds, and then again, and then again. What do you notice? It is possible that the UFO is actually travelling along the blue line, but I think it's much more likely that the UFO is there, where the black dot is. A static point sitting above the university, and the only reason that the UFO appears to be moving hell for leather towards the northeast is because the aircraft is moving hell for leather in the opposite direction towards the southwest. So the object, I think, is actually static. If you take another minute or two of the video, which I didn't show you, you can continue those red dots until the aircraft flies a long way further south. And amazingly enough, it can still see this object. It's a great infrared camera. And I think that black dot, after a minute or two, has moved ever so slightly towards the southwest. Remember which way the wind is blowing, towards the southwest. So there is actually no evidence that this object is actually travelling towards the northeast into a headwind. If you look at the description on YouTube, it says this is the gold standard of UFO sightings. What we're looking at is a metallic orb moving at incredible speed with no obvious propulsion into an 18-mile-an-hour headwind, and the expert says the infrared camera sees an object that does not match anything we know of. Well, one, the video cannot distinguish a metallic orb from a little blob. That's all we can say. It's a blob that seems to be warmer than its surroundings because it's an infrared camera. No way we can tell it's metallic. No way we can tell it's an orb. Moving at incredible speed. No, the video does not prove that it's moving at incredible speed. It has no obvious propulsion. Well, I would agree with that. It doesn't have wings, it doesn't have an engine, it doesn't have a propeller. No obvious propulsion. And it's moving into an 18-mile-an-hour headwind. No, it's not. The expert says this does not match anything we know of. Well, I don't know who that expert is, but it doesn't seem to tally. This expert is talking rubbish. Occam's razor says, on the left we have a very complex explanation for what we're looking at. I would offer an alternative explanation, the black dot. I think the object is essentially static. It is not moving at incredible speed. It's essentially not moving at all. Well, maybe it's moving a little bit. It's drifting very slowly downwind. What sort of object hangs in the sky and moves very slowly with the breeze? I think it's a balloon. Which is the simpler explanation? An object that can't be explained, or a balloon drifting downwind? Now that I think it's a balloon, we can revisit that and say, well, there's no obvious propulsion. Well, there's no obvious propeller or engine, but I think there is an obvious propulsion. It's drifting with the wind. So that ought to be an X as well. So you can see that as soon as you apply Occam's razor, even to this, which is supposed to be the gold standard of UFO videos, you can see that everything just falls to pieces. And I would not be surprised, I've looked at 2 or 3, but I would not be surprised if all such videos that purport to show an object moving at high speed as photographed from either a civilian or a military aircraft fall into the same category. Let's have a look at other UFOs that are natural objects. Clouds of the month. Yes, there is such a thing as cloud of the month. Various clouds can offer very odd looking structures. You're probably familiar with the lenticular clouds, which look a little bit like UFOs. The one in the top right looks a bit weird. A large puffy cloud that seems to be structured in a large circle, but actually that's probably just an aircraft circling slightly above the cloud deck, producing disturbances in the cloud. There were lots of other spectacular cloud formations. This one in the bottom right is called a Fall Street cloud. It looks like a large flying saucer has just punched a hole in the cloud. But there are meteorological explanations for clouds forming like that. I'm not going to go into details. And you can get spectacular lenticular clouds here over Mount Fuji. Even though they're spectacular in their own right, it doesn't stop people putting this picture into Photoshop and deciding to embellish it somewhat. This is rather unusual, something I've never actually seen myself, light pillars. It might look like a whole load of spotlight shining vertically into the sky, but actually over the horizon there were just normal street lights. What we're looking at is reflections in ice crystals that are forming. You can see snow on the ground there, not surprisingly. This is taken at rather northern latitudes where there's likely to be some ice crystals in the atmosphere. Ice crystals are small hexagonal plates. They tend to sit horizontally and they can form effectively small mirrors and reflect light that you can't see over your horizon, producing these pillars of light. Sometimes they can reflect light from quite some distance. They might appear coloured, but only because the lights themselves are coloured that you can't quite see over the horizon. And in some cases, the ice crystals can be quite high in the atmosphere and can reflect light from quite some distance away. Here you get the impression that there's an entire city floating in the sky. Quite a bizarre sight. Until recently, it was thought that this phenomena, red sprites, might not exist at all. People reported seeing unusual phenomena above thunderclouds, but it wasn't until relatively recent times that they've been photographed. Just like you can get lightning strikes between a cloud and the ground, it's possible to get sort of the equivalent of a lightning strike from the cloud up to the upper ionosphere, the upper atmosphere. They're not as bright as would indicate in this photograph, and they are very much fleeting. They only exist for a fraction of a second, but these images of, if you like, vertical lightning coming up from a thunderstorm can be captured. Here, Astronomy Picture of the Day 2017. And more recently, an even more bizarre photograph of the same phenomena in 2023, where you get this really weird result of what looks like a dendritic sort of lightning strike above a thunderstorm, but then it ends in this rather odd cone structure at the top. And this is still very much an active area of research, trying to understand what exactly is going on with these electric discharges above a thunderstorm. And again, if you weren't aware of the fact that these were natural phenomena, you could easily be convinced with a photograph like this that we were witnessing an alien invasion of some kind. Being astronomers, you can probably guess this one. An arc-shaped UFO was seen over Ontario. The quote was, "Nearing the end of the day, I sat down on my deck facing west. Something caught my eye. It was brilliant white." You might already guess what is it that you might see in the evening at sunset when you're looking west. In truth, I cannot be sure what it truly is. But my conclusion is a UFO. In other words, the knee-jerk reflex, if you don't know what it is it must be an unidentified flying object. How big was this object? Well, my friend thinks the object is as big as 2 airliners. There's this bizarre idea that even though you can't tell how far away an object is, you can still guess its size, which of course is ridiculous. If it's a small object, then you can't really tell its distance and therefore you can't tell its size. So estimating its size as the size of 2 airliners is really not helpful. That's what his friend thought. The photographer thought different. I thought 1 airliner, but maybe he's right. So what is it that could conceivably be arc-shaped and brilliant white and seen in the west after sunset? Yes, it's Venus. Venus accounts for so many UFOs. This is a still taken from a video in which I guess he's got a small camera with a very large zoom lens, and eventually he zoomed in enough and then blown up the image to show that the object is arc-shaped or crescent-shaped, which of course is pretty much what you'd expect at various times of the year when Venus is catching the rays of the sun. Let's have a look at another category. We've thought about man-made, we've thought about natural. What about image artifacts? Whenever somebody says, I've got this photograph and there seems to be something odd in it, I don't remember seeing it at the time, but here it is in the photo, almost 99.9% of the time we're looking at an image artifact. If you didn't notice it when you took the photograph, it probably wasn't there. Back in 1952, some lights were seen over the Washington DC skyline. You can see a whole set of them buzzing around in formation there. But no one actually saw this, it simply turned up on the photograph. And it doesn't take much to realise that you can figure out what it is by looking at the foreground. Look at those street lights right at the bottom of the image. Take those street lights, flip them upside down, because that's what reflections do, and you realise that what we're looking at is simply a whole load of reflections. Each of those, 1, 2 there, 1, 2 slightly more separated there, a couple we can't see because the dome gets in the way, another one there, etc. Another one just off frame. Whenever we look at reflections, if bright lights are shining into the camera, doesn't matter how good quality the camera lens is, there will always be some reflection. And if you have a bright enough object, the light will be reflected and you'll probably see those reflections. And that's what we're looking at here. Because reflections tend to invert things, we simply need to look at the light source, invert it, and see if it matches the mysterious objects we're trying to explain. Here, for instance, somebody is claiming that there was a large spacecraft came close to the photographer, so close that windows could be seen in the image. I don't quite know what they mean. I don't know if they mean this is a window in the UFO. But they say that this UFO sighting is 100% proof that aliens are here on Earth. You can tell they're serious because aliens is in capitals. That's how serious they are about showing you this UFO image. But this is only a crop of the full image. If you look at the original image, you realise it was actually taken with the camera pointing into what I guess is a full moon. A very bright object is shining directly into the camera, producing a horrible reflection. I would guess, no disrespect to the photographer, but I would guess this is a rather cheap lens which has got a horrible reflection in it and produces that rather weird looking shape on the left-hand side there. Perhaps modern lenses would do a rather better job and reduce the reflections to something altogether smaller. This is a more recent example of the same thing. Somebody posted on social media, "What is this object in the sky? I don't remember seeing it when I took the picture. It seems to have an aura around it. Is it a UFO?" And then they added hashtag UFO. And just to show that they were serious, hashtag serious question. They did really want to know what that is. So that odd looking object in the sky seems to have a little aura around it. But again, remember what's going on. We are taking a picture here shooting directly into the sun. The sun is peeking out behind that wall and producing a reflection. If we blow it up, what do we actually see? Well, remember the sun would appear as a disk, about 1/2 degree or so in diameter. And the sun in this particular case is partly hidden by the wall because the sun is just peeking through, half hidden, half exposed, through the filigree work of this particular lampstand. So what we're seeing in the reflection is a disc, or at least half a disc, because some of the disc has been cut off by the wall. Remember, the reflection is upside down. And this odd looking structure we can see inside the disk of the sun is simply the filigree work of the lamp stand, because that's casting shadows and hence the reflection looks the way it does. Entirely explicable simply because the sun is shining into the camera. This I like. This one I like. Here's a huge slab-shaped UFO hovering in the sky. What appears to be a flat, rectangular aircraft with lights around its edges hovering in the air. UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists have claimed it is an advanced type of spy craft known as a TR-3B. Notice how that when you give it a number or a name like TR-3B, it adds an air of authenticity. It must be real because it's got a designation. What are we looking at? Well, I'm guessing we're looking through the windscreen of a car. We can see some cars in the distance. We can see what appears to be raindrops reflecting the headlights of distant vehicles, so I think we're looking through a windscreen at night on a rainy day. Are we looking at a big slab-shaped object hovering in the sky? Or, because we're looking through a windscreen, are we looking at the reflection of an iPhone sitting on the dashboard underneath the windscreen? Occam's razor. Is it a huge slab in the sky? Is it an iPhone sitting on the dashboard? I know which one I think it is. Next category, UFOs might be deliberately faked. You can tell it's faked when somebody's pointing at it. I mean, that's fairly obvious. And also, when you have something like this, something a mile wide appearing over the interstate, well, if that actually happened, then a few million people would have seen it, and I think we would have heard about that. But what about more obscure photos? Here was one taken from many decades ago. This must have been on film originally, and then it's been digitized. We can look at this and we can ask ourselves, is that real? We seem to have a few houses, and we seem to have what I'm guessing are tram lines here in the foreground. If this is focused correctly, which it appears to be, then the camera is effectively focused at infinity. If these objects are more distant than the tram lines, then with the normal depth of focus you would expect in a camera lens, these ought to be in focus as well. But if you look in detail at the UFO and in detail at the tram lines appear to be about as sharp as they can be, and yet the UFOs have been deliberately blurred. So it looks like they've been cut and pasted into the image and deliberately blurred so that you can't see any detail in the image itself. Now, the opposite problem occurs with this particular video. It was a still from a video. I'm not going to show you the video. That doesn't really matter. This is apparently shocking new footage of an alien ship over Chicago. One of the best sightings in 2015, they say. But if we take that still, let's just process it a little bit so we can see it more clearly. This is the opposite of what we've just seen, where a UFO was added to the image and then blurred too much. Here we see some noise in the background. It's perfectly normal for JPEG or MPEG data, in other words, movies or individual photographs, to have some sort of noise in the background. You wouldn't expect every pixel to have exactly the same value, even if it's taken in a blue sky or a black sky. But here, notice that the triangular UFO has been superposed on the sky and its edges are razor sharp, even though the rest of the image is quite mottled because of normal noise that you would expect to get. From pixel to pixel to pixel, you'd expect some variation, and you'd expect that variation along the edges as well. So this has been cut and paste, and it hasn't been mottled enough. They've left it super sharp where they shouldn't have done that if they're trying to claim that this is a UFO. Are these a couple of UFOs that are buzzing Air Force One in the distance? This is still half a mile away, which is why it looks a little bit fuzzy. And notice that there's a lot of air between us and Air Force One, which is why it's a little bit blurred and also not perfectly contrasty. Even the unlit underside of the aircraft is not truly black or dark. It's a sort of bluey colour because of scattering by the Earth's atmosphere. Even though these UFOs are supposed to be the same sort of distance as Air Force One, they appear to have the wrong amount of contrast. This is not what you would expect for an object half a mile away. So again, this is a cut and paste error on the part of those producing the fakery. I thought this one was worth a closer look. This is the deck of an aircraft carrier in which there's an F-18 jet in the foreground, a helicopter, and what's purported to be a triangular UFO. I think this is fake, but I wondered, is it actually possible to prove that this is a forgery? Is this a fake? So I looked at individual pixel values. If you look at pixel values, remember what I said in the previous slide, that you would expect to get some variation when you look at pixel to pixel to pixel. Even though it appears quite smooth, you would expect to get some variation. So I looked at pixel values along a grey strip close to the F-18 jet, which I believe is a genuine F-18 jet sitting on the aircraft carrier. And when I plotted the intensity of the grey value, in other words, the intensity of the pixel, it doesn't matter what the numbers mean, this is just how bright is the pixel as a function of which pixel we're looking at. I looked at 70 pixels along that grey line. And you see you get a normal variation. It's getting a little darker at one end than the other, that doesn't matter. What I'm looking at is the fact that it's a perfectly natural variation because no image will show individual pixels perfectly aligned in terms of their intensity. But look what happens if I inspect the grey area just next door to the UFO. If I look up there, what do I find? In this region, I find, again, pixel intensity as a function of position, perfectly normal variation, but when I get close to the UFO, look at that. Every pixel is an identical value, not just similar, but identical. And then it goes back to normal again. So somebody has cut and pasted this object onto the aircraft carrier and then in some sort of graphics package has smoothed the pixel values to the point where they're all the same value. It might look okay, but it is totally unnatural. So that quite definitely is a doctored image. And I purport that you can tell for most UFO images that have been faked, you can inspect them very carefully and you can see the fakery. Here's one image where it's again a still from a video where a passenger is looking out of a commercial aircraft window and sees a UFO buzzing by in the opposite direction. Well, maybe that's a UFO, but when I looked at that, I thought it bore a striking resemblance to the CGI craft that's seen in a certain video game whose name I can't mention for legal reasons. These are available on the web, they're very easy to download and they're very easy to cut and paste into a video which you can then purport to be a UFO video. So again, fakery usually is fairly obvious, but perhaps as tools become more sophisticated, it's going to be more and more difficult to tell if these images and videos have been faked. AI is very good at generating images and it won't be long before we literally cannot tell truth from fiction. So I've been through the 4 categories of man-made objects, natural objects, image artifacts and fakery. And of course, the 5th possibility is UFOs might be extraterrestrial spacecraft. Now, some people have done the dirty work for us by trying to work out all the different types of UFO that exist, and they've catalogued them, A1, A2, A3. Notice that there are 80 UFO models, and these are based on actual sightings, says the person who generated this image. I find this interesting that not only are there 80 of them, but this is UFO sightings set 1. I wonder, I never managed to find set 2, set 3, set 4, but it would imply that there are hundreds of different shapes of UFOs. None of these have been caught on camera, they're simply based on reportings of individuals saying, that's what I saw. If we want to be more reliable, we can go to a more reliable source and say, look at all of the data, look at all of the images of UFOs and see if you can come to a conclusion about what they are. This is precisely what NASA did recently. They had an independent study team report on UFOs, now called Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena, UAPs. What did they conclude? Well, they said in the report, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you remember, that's where I started this talk. They also said that most photographs are unreliable because the metadata, the information about the exposure, the aperture, the date, the time, who took it, etc., most of that data are often absent, making a thorough understanding of the context difficult. This, again, is something I mentioned very early on. Their conclusion: there is no conclusive evidence suggesting an extraterrestrial origin for UAPs. NASA spent millions on this report. If they'd come to me in the first place, I would have told them exactly that, and they could have saved a few $1,000,000. Oh well, never mind. But then that begs the question, if there's no evidence for extraterrestrials, why is there no evidence for extraterrestrials? The lack of evidence leads to a question. If we think about the population of the Milky Way, some 300 billion stars, we now know that most of them have planetary systems. So that's 150 billion planetary systems. Quite a few of these planets are Earth-like. A decade ago, we weren't sure. Now we've got a pretty good idea that a lot of them are Earth-like, similar in Earth in terms of mass and distance from the sun, even though the sun may be a little hotter or a little cooler. Now the big question is, will life originate on Earth-like planets? We do not know. Let's assume there's only a 1 in 100 chance of life grabbing hold. Some people think it's inevitable. Let's assume it's only a 1% chance. And if life does get hold, let's assume that the chances of life developing into complex life is only again 1% of that. So let's divide that number by 100 again. And what's the chance of that complex life developing intelligent life? Let's again divide by 100. Let's assume it's 1% of 1% of 1% is the likelihood that intelligent life will evolve. That leaves us with 50,000 civilizations in the galaxy. So if the galaxy has that many civilizations, where are they? Now, there are all sorts of reasons as to why they might not exist. Maybe civilizations don't last very long. Maybe they have no interest in visiting us whatsoever. Maybe they're keeping their own existence secret. But if we think of the pale blue dot, the Carl Sagan image taken from Voyager, look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, every human being who ever was lived out their lives on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The pale blue dot, Carl Sagan, 1994. It reminds us that the only life we know about is the life on Earth, and we have no evidence for or against extraterrestrial life. But what I find more unsettling than the idea that we've been visited by extraterrestrial spacecraft is the thought that we might actually be alone. Thank you for listening.